The Vaults of Yoh Vombis. Preface. As an intern in the terrestrial hospital at Ignar, I had charge of the singular case of Rodney Severn, the one surviving member of the Octave expedition to Yoh Vombis, and took down the following story from his dictation. Severn had been brought to the hospital by the Martian guides of the expedition. He was suffering from a horribly lacerated and inflamed condition of the scalp and brow, and was wildly delirious part of the time and had to be held down in his bed during recurrent seizures of a mania whose violence was doubly inexplicable in view of his extreme debility. The lacerations, as will be learned from the story, were mainly self-inflicted. They were mingled with numerous small round wounds easily distinguished from the knife slashes and arranged in regular circles, through which an unknown poison had been injected into Severn's scalp. The causation of these wounds was difficult to explain, unless one were to believe that Severn's story was true and was no mere figment of his illness. Speaking for myself, in the light of what afterwards occurred, I feel that I have no other recourse than to believe it. There are strange things on the Red Planet, and I can only second the wish that was expressed by the doomed archaeologist in regard to future explorations. The night after he finished telling me his story, while another doctor than myself was supposedly on duty, Severn managed to escape from the hospital, doubtless in one of the strange seizures at which I have hinted. A most astonishing thing, for he had seemed weaker than ever after the long strain of his terrible narrative, and his demise had been hourly expected. More astonishing still, his bare footsteps were found in the desert, going toward Yoh Vombis, till they vanished in the path of a light sandstorm. But no trace of Severn himself has yet been discovered. The narrative of Rodney Severn. If the doctors are correct in their prognostication, I have only a few Martian hours of life remaining to me. In those hours I shall endeavor to relate, as a warning to others who might follow in our footsteps, the singular and frightful happenings that terminated our researches among the ruins of Yoh Vombis. Somehow, even in my extremity, I shall contrive to tell the story, since there is no one else to do it. But the telling will be toilsome and broken, and after I am done the madness will recur, and several men will restrain me, lest I should leave the hospital and return across many desert leagues to those abominable vaults, beneath the compulsion of the malignant and malevolent virus which is permeating my brain. Perhaps death will release me from that abhorrent control, which would urge me down to bottomless underworld warrens of terror for which the saner planets of the solar system can have no analog. I say perhaps, for remembering what I have seen, I am not sure that even death will end my bondage. There were 8 of us, professional archaeologists with more or less terrene and interplanetary experience, who set forth with native guides from Ignar, the commercial metropolis of Mars, to inspect that ancient, eon-deserted city. Alan Octave, our official leader, held his primacy by virtue of knowing more about Martian archaeology than any other terrestrial on the planet, and others of the party, such as William Harper and Jonas Halgren, had been associated with him in many of his previous researches. I, Rodney Severn, was more of a newcomer, having spent but a few months on Mars, and the greater part of my own ultra-terrene delvings had been confined to Venus. I had often heard of Yoh Vombis in a vague and legendary sort of manner, and never at first hand. Even the ubiquitous Octave had never seen it. Builded by an extinct people whose history has been lost in the latter decadent eras of the planet, it remains a dim and fascinating riddle whose solution has never been approached, and which, I trust, may endure forevermore unsolved by man. Certainly, I hope that no one will ever follow in our steps. Contrary to the impression we had received from Martian stories, we found that the semi-fabulous ruins lay at no great distance from Ignar, with its terrestrial colony and consulates. The nude, spongy-chested natives had spoken deterringly of vast deserts filled with ever-swirling sandstorms, through which we must pass to reach Yoh Vombis. And in spite of our munificent offers of payment, it had been difficult to secure guides for the journey. We had provisioned ourselves amply and had prepared for all emergencies that might eventuate during a long trip. Therefore, we were pleased as well as surprised when we came to the ruins after 7 hours of plodding across the flat, treeless, orange-yellow desolation to the southwest of Ignar. On account of the lesser gravity, the journey was far less tiring than one who is unfamiliar with Martian conditions might expect. But because of the thin, Himalaya-like air and the possible strain on our hearts, we had been careful not to hasten. Our coming to Yoh Vombis was sudden and spectacular. Climbing the low slope of a league-long elevation of bare and deeply eroded stone, we saw before us the shattered walls of our destination, whose highest tower was notching the small remote sun that glared in stifled crimson through the floating haze of fine sand. For a little, we thought that the domeless, three-angled towers and broken-down monoliths were those of some unlegended city, other than the one we sought. But the disposition of the ruins, which lay in a sort of arc for almost the entire extent of the low and gneissic elevation, together with the type of architecture, soon convinced us that we had found our goal. No other ancient city on Mars had been laid out in that manner, and the strange, many-terraced buttresses of the thick walls, like the stairways of forgotten Anakim, were peculiar to the prehistoric race that had built Yoh Vombis. Moreover, Yoh Vombis was the one remaining example of this architecture aside from a few fragments in the neighborhood of Ignar, which we had previously examined. I have seen the hoary, sky-confronting walls of Machu Picchu amid the desolate Andes, and the Teocalli that are buried in the Mexican jungles. And I have seen the frozen, giant-builded battlements of Urgam on the glacial tundras of the nightward hemisphere of Venus. But these were as things of yesteryear, bearing at least the memory or the intimation of life, compared with the awesome and lefiferous antiquity, the cycle-enduring doom of a petrified sterility that seemed to invest Yoh Vombis. The whole region was far from the life-giving canals beyond whose environs even the more noxious flora and fauna are seldom found, and we had seen no living thing since our departure from Ignar. But here, in this place of eternal bareness and solitude, it seemed that life could never have been. The stark, eroded stones were things that might have been reared by the toil of the dead, to house the monstrous ghouls and demons of primal desolation. I think we all received the same impression as we stood staring in silence while the pale, sunny-like sunset fell on the dark and megalithic ruins. I remember gasping a little, in an air that seemed to have been touched by the irrespirable chill of death, and I heard the same sharp, laborious intake of breath from others of our party.
"That place is deader than an Egyptian morgue," observed Harper.
"Certainly it is far more ancient," Octave assented. "According to the most reliable legends, the Yoris, who built Yoh Vombis, were wiped out by the present ruling race at least 40,000 years ago."
"There's a story, isn't there?" said Harper. "That the last remnant of the Yoris was destroyed by some unknown agency. Something too horrible and outre to be mentioned even in a myth?"
"Of course, I've heard that legend. agreed Octave. Maybe we'll find evidence among the ruins to prove or disprove it. The Yoris may have been cleaned out by some terrible epidemic, such as the Yosta pestilence, which was a kind of green mold that ate all the bones of the body, starting with the teeth and nails. But we needn't be afraid of getting it. If there are any mummies in Yoh Vombis, the bacteria will all be dead as their victims, after so many cycles of planetary desiccation. Anyway, there ought to be a lot for us to learn. The Ihace have always been more or less shy of the place. Few have ever visited it, and none, as far as I can find, have made a thorough examination of the ruins. The sun had gone down with uncanny swiftness, as if it had disappeared through some sort of prestidigitation rather than the normal process of setting. We felt the instant chill of the blue-green twilight, and the ether above us was like a huge, transparent dome of sunless ice, shot with a million bleak sparklings that were the stars. We donned the coats and helmets of Martian fur, which must always be worn at night, and going on to westward of the walls, we established our camp in their lee, so that we might be sheltered a little from the Ja'ar, that cruel desert wind that always blows from the east before dawn. Then, lighting the alcohol lamps that had been brought along for cooking purposes, we huddled around them while the evening meal was prepared and eaten. Afterwards, for comfort rather than because of weariness, we retired early to our sleeping bags, and the two Ihace, our guides, wrapped themselves in the cerement-like folds of gray bassa cloth, which are all the protection their leathery skins appear to require even in sub-zero temperatures. Even in my thick, double-lined bag, I still felt the rigor of the night air, and I am sure it was this, rather than anything else, which kept me awake for a long while, and rendered my eventual slumber somewhat restless and broken. Of course, the strangeness of our situation, and the weird proximity of those Aeonian walls and towers may in some measure have contributed to my unrest. But at any rate, I was not troubled by even the least presentiment of alarm or danger, and I should have laughed at the idea that anything of peril could lurk in Yoh Vombis. Amid those undreamable and stupefying antiquities, the very phantoms of its dead must long since have faded into nothingness. I remember little, however, except the feeling of interminable duration that often marks a shallow and interrupted sleep. I recall the marrow-piercing wind that moaned above us toward midnight, and the sand that stung my face like a fine hail as it passed, blowing from desert to immemorial desert, and I recall the still, inflexible stars that grew dim for a while with that fleeing ancient dust. Then the wind went by, and I drowsed again with starts of semi-wakefulness. At last, in one of these, I knew vaguely that the small twin moons, Phobos and Deimos, had risen and were making huge and spectral shadows with the ruins and were casting an ashen glimmer on the shrouded forms of my companions. I must have been half asleep, for the memory of that which I saw is doubtful as any dream. I watched beneath drooping lids the tiny moons that had topped the domeless triangular towers, and I saw the far-flung shadows that almost touched the bodies of my fellow archaeologists. The whole scene was locked in a petrific stillness, and none of the sleepers stirred. Then, as my lids were about to close, I received an impression of movement in the frozen gloom, and it seemed to me that a portion of the foremost shadow had detached itself and was crawling toward Octave, who lay nearer to the ruins than we others. Even through my heavy lethargy, I was disturbed by a warning of something unnatural and perhaps ominous. I started to sit up, and even as I moved, the shadowy object, whatever it was, drew back and became merged once more in the greater shadow. Its vanishment startled me into full wakefulness, and yet I could not be sure that I had actually seen the thing. In that brief, final glimpse, it had seemed like a roughly circular piece of cloth or leather, dark and crumpled and 12 or 14 inches in diameter, that ran along the ground with the doubling movement of an inchworm, causing it to fold and unfold in a startling manner as it went. I did not go to sleep again for nearly an hour, and if it had not been for the extreme cold, I should doubtless have gotten up to investigate and make sure whether I had really beheld an object of such bizarre nature or had merely dreamt it. I lay staring at the deep, ebon shadow in which it had disappeared, while a series of fanciful wonderings followed each other in antic procession through my mind. Even then, though somewhat perturbed, I was not aware of any actual fear or intuition of possible menace. And more I began to convince myself that the thing was too unlikely and fantastical to have been anything but the figment of a dream. And at last I nodded off into light slumber. The chill, demoniac sighing of the jar across the jagged walls awoke me, and I saw that the faint moonlight had received the hueless accession of early dawn. We all arose and prepared our breakfast with fingers that grew numb in spite of the spirit lamps. Then, shivering, we ate, while the sun leapt over the horizon like a juggler's ball. Enormous, gaunt, without gradations of shadow or luminosity, the ruins beetled before us in the thin light, like the mausolea of primordial giants that abide from darkness-eaten eons to confront the last dawn of an expiring orb. My queer visual experience during the night had taken on more than ever a phantasmagoric unreality, and I gave it no more than a passing thought and did not speak of it to the others. But even as the faint, distorted shadows of slumber often tinge one's waking hours, it may have contributed to the nameless mood in which I found myself, a mood in which I felt the unhuman alienage of our surroundings and the black, fathomless antiquity of the ruins like an almost unbearable oppression. The feeling seemed to be made of a million spectral adumbrations that oozed, unseen but palpable, from the great, unearthly architecture that weighed upon me like tomb-born incubi, but were void of form and meaning such as could be comprehended by human thought. I appeared to move, not in the open air, but in the smothering gloom of sealed, sepulchral vaults, to choke with a death-fraught atmosphere, with the miasmata of eon-old corruption. My companions were all eager to explore the ruins, and of course it was impossible for me to even mention the apparently absurd and baseless shadows of my mood. Human beings on other worlds than our own are often subject to nervous and psychic symptoms of this sort, engendered by the unfamiliar forces, the novel radiations of their environment. But as we approached the buildings in our preliminary tour of examination, I lagged behind the others, seized by a paralyzing panic that left me unable to move or breathe for a few moments. A dark, freezing clamminess seemed to pervade my brain and muscles and suspend their inmost working. Then it lifted, and I was free to go on and follow the others. Strangely, as it seemed, the two Martians refused to accompany us. Stolid and taciturn, they gave no explicit reason, but evidently nothing would induce them to enter Yoh Vombis. Whether or not they were afraid of the ruins we were unable to determine. Their enigmatic faces, with the small oblique eyes and huge flaring nostrils, betrayed neither fear nor any other emotion intelligible to man. In reply to our questions, they merely said that no Ihe had set foot among the ruins for ages. Apparently there was some mysterious taboo in connection with the place. For equipment in that preliminary tour, we took along only a crowbar and 2 picks. Our other tools and some cartridges of high explosives we left at our camp, to be used later if necessary, after we had surveyed the ground. 1 or 2 of us owned automatics, but these were also left behind. for it seemed absurd to imagine that any form of life would be encountered among the ruins. Octave was visibly excited as we began our inspection, and maintained a running fire of exclamatory comment. The rest of us were subdued and silent, and I think that my own feeling, in a measure, was shared by many of the others. It was impossible to shake off the somber awe and wonder that fell upon us from those megalithic stones. I have no time to describe the ruins minutely, but must hasten on with my story. There is much that I could not describe anyway, for the main area of the city was destined to remain unexplored. We went on for some distance among the triangular, terraced buildings, following the zigzag streets that conformed to this peculiar architecture. Most of the towers were more or less dilapidated, and everywhere we saw the deep erosion wrought by cycles of blowing wind and sand, which, in many cases, had worn into roundness the sharp angles of the mighty walls. We entered some of the towers through high, narrow doorways, but found utter emptiness within. Whatever they had contained in the way of furnishings must have long ago crumbled into dust, and the dust had been blown away by the searching desert gales. On some of the outer walls there was evidence of carving or lettering, but all of it was so worn down and obliterated by time that we could trace only a few fragmentary outlines, of which we could make nothing. At length we came to a wide thoroughfare which ended in the wall of a vast terrace, several 100 yards long by perhaps 40 in height, on which the central buildings were grouped like a sort of citadel or acropolis. A flight of broken steps, designed for longer limbs than those of men or even the gangling modern Martians, afforded access to the terrace, which had seemingly been hewn from the plateau itself. Pausing, we decided to defer our investigation of the higher buildings, which, being more exposed than the others, were doubly ruinous and dilapidated, and in all likelihood would offer little for our trouble. Octave had begun to voice his disappointment over our failure to find anything in the nature of artifacts or carvings that would throw light on the history of Yoh Vombis. Then, a little to the right of the stairway, we perceived an entrance in the main wall, half choked with ancient debris. Behind the heap of detritus, we found the beginning of a downward flight of steps. Darkness poured from the opening like a visible flood, noisome and musty with primordial stagnancies of decay, and we could see nothing below the first steps, which gave the appearance of being suspended over a black gulf. Octave and myself and several others had brought along electric torches in case we should need them in our explorations. It had occurred to us that there might be subterranean vaults or catacombs in Yoh Vombis, even as in the latter-day cities of Mars, which are often more extensive underground than above, and such vaults would be the likeliest place in which to look for vestiges of the Yorhi civilization. Throwing his torch beam into the abyss, Octave began to descend the stairs. His eager voice called us to follow. Again, for an instant, the unknown irrational panic froze my faculties, and I hesitated while the others pressed forward behind me. Then, as before, the terror passed, and I wondered at myself for being overcome by anything so absurd and unfounded. I followed Octave down the steps, and the others came trooping after me. At the bottom of the high, awkward steps, we found ourselves in a long and roomy vault like a subterranean hallway. Its floor was deep with the siftings of immemorial dust, and in places there were heaps of a coarse gray powder, such as might be left by the decomposition of certain fungi that grow in the Martian catacombs under the canals. Such fungi at one time might conceivably have existed in Yoh Vombis, but owing to the prolonged and excessive dehydration they must have died out long ago. Nothing, surely, not even a fungus, could have lived in those arid vaults for many eons past. The air was singularly heavy, as if the lees of an ancient atmosphere, less tenuous than that of Mars today, had settled down and remained in that stagnant darkness. It was harder to breathe than the outer air. It was filled with unknown effluvia, and the light dust arose before us at every step, diffusing a faintness of bygone corruption, like the dust of powdered mummies. At the end of the vault, before a straight and lofty doorway, our torches revealed an immense shallow urn or pan, supported on short cube-shaped legs, and wrought from a dull blackish-green material which suggested some bizarre alloy of metal and porcelain. The thing was about 4 feet across, with a thick rim adorned by writhing, indecipherable figures deeply etched as if by acid. In the bottom of the bowl we perceived a deposit of dark and cinder-like fragments, which gave off a slight but disagreeable pungence, like the phantom of some more powerful odor. Octave, bending over the rim, began to cough and sneeze as he inhaled it.
"That stuff, whatever it was, must have been a pretty strong fumigant," he observed. "The people of Yoh Vombis may have used it to disinfect the vaults." The doorway beyond the shallow urn admitted us to a larger chamber, whose floor was comparatively free of dust. We found that the dark stone beneath our feet was marked off in multiform geometric patterns, traced with ochreous ore, amid which, as in Egyptian cartouches, hieroglyphics and highly formalized drawings were enclosed. We could make little from most of them, but the figures in many were doubtless designed to represent the Yoris themselves. Like the Ihace, they were tall and angular, with great bellows-like chests, and they were depicted as possessing a supplementary third arm which issued from the bosom, a characteristic which, in vestigial form, sometimes occurs among the Ihace. The ears and nostrils, as far as we could judge, were not so huge and flaring as those of the modern Martians. All of these Yoris were represented as being nude, but in one of the cartouches, done in a far hastier style than the others, we perceived 2 figures whose high conical craniums were wrapped in what seemed to be a sort of turban, which they were about to remove or adjust. The artist seemed to have laid a peculiar emphasis on the odd gesture with which the sinuous, 4-jointed fingers were plucking at these headdresses, and the whole posture was unexplainably contorted.